of the bastion of workers. They're the thin line of defense that keeps employment from being exploitative and slavery. Allowing workers to sell this right is like allowing them to sell themselves into slavery. What am I going to talk to you about today? I'm going to talk to you about number one, this is a right that the state cannot allow workers to sell because the state has fundamental freedoms that it must protect. Number two, I'm going to talk to you about the idea of hyperbolic discounting. I'm going to bring in the perspective of the worker and why this is a decision that's damaging to the worker in the long run and why it's one that he should not make. But before I move on, I have several points of rebuttal. The first thing I want to do is attack their proposal, right? Because they said we're going to have weekly or monthly meetings where workers can negotiate with their managers. We're going to make sure that the state is in this level and we're going to make sure that they're not being exploitative, right? By definition, this is a union, which means they conceded the principle that workers have to come together and negotiate with managers. They conceded the principle that workers have to be able to have that power of collective bargaining to negotiate with managers. By definition, this is exactly what a union is. So that means that they conceded the principle that they must have like this kind of thing. Then they give us this idea, no thank you, that unions are only for economic benefits. This is simply untrue, right? Because while to a certain extent unions are for economic benefits, like negotiating for higher wages, I'm going to argue later on why it's not only for economic benefits. It's also for things like working conditions, how clean your area is, or how many hours you have to work. That's not an economic thing, that's a working condition thing, which isn't directly tied to wage, and why that's something that cannot be sold off in their policy. No thank you. And then lastly, they said that we have to have options for workers because some workers can't join unions. Simple response, we think that make it easier for them to join unions, right? Make unions have that require less, but still make it easier for these workers who are so-called disenfranchised. Make it easier for them to enter these kinds of unions. Have those kinds of mechanisms. If they are able to have these workers who don't want to join unions participate in these weekly or monthly meetings, then we can have these workers join or easier to join unions. If they can have their cake, then we can have our cake as well. But before I move on to my arguments, yes.
Are there already basic laws on due process, corporate social responsibility in the workplace, even without the labor unions?
Then where does the debate take place if these things already exist? The fact that we have to debate about these unions first means that there has to be some kind of like working mechanism so that workers can negotiate. If the workplace is so great, then there's no need for your policy either. So I don't understand where the debate takes place. By the way, they have conceded that unions do work in getting benefits, right? They give us the example of Walmart workers who are in labor unions who are able to gain benefits in terms of their overtime work. That's a concession that unions can work in terms of being able to get these benefits. They said that some Walmart workers aren't able to derive these benefits because they aren't in these unions. Simple response again, make it easier for them to join these unions. We don't understand why it's so hard if you can have these kinds of weekly meetings, which are essentially just unions as well. On to my arguments then. To the first argument. Why, in principle, the state can't let this happen because it must protect fundamental freedoms. And here's one of that the right to join unions is afforded to you by the state. It isn't natural, but it is afforded to you by the state. And in line with that, we think that the state does have. Why does the state afford this to you, anyway? The state affords this to you precisely because the state recognizes that there are fundamental freedoms that it must protect for you as an individual within that state. We pointed to the example of you not being allowed to sell your vote, or you not being allowed to sell your right to freely speak, which is essentially what the union is. It's being able to freely speak and negotiate, no thank you, against your managers or your employers. Why is this so? It's because if the state allows you to sell these rights, if the state allows you to let go of these freedoms that it guarantees you, then it has failed in its duty to protect these things. We want to paralyze the things like slavery, right? Because in some cases, while it might be an extreme example, the logic still applies. Because for some people, slavery might have a pragmatic benefit, like what they want, the economic benefit of being able to sell yourself into doing something because, maybe you're desperate or you need more money or something like that. But we tell you that the state doesn't allow you to sell yourself into slavery because that's dehumanizing. While that's on the extreme end of the spectrum, we think that the logical flow still applies. Because the state doesn't allow you to sell your right to be in a union because unions are there to protect you. Unions are the mechanism, as they agree, to protect you from capitalist greed, to protect you from the abuse of work of Samsung or Apple in China that abuse their workers. We think that this is how the state implements its right. While there might be laws, the union is the fundamental way, it's the most basic way that the state ensures that you have the ability to negotiate and you have the ability to protect yourself against potentially abusive employers. So we think that if the state allows you to sell this right, in principle, even if there might be some economic benefit coming from their side of the house, that economic benefit is superseded by the fact that the state has to protect its principles, and the state has to protect its ability to protect workers. But before I move on to my second argument about why this decision should not be made by workers because of hyperbolic discounting and many other things, go ahead.
Doesn't the state have the burden to protect you as well if this right now harms you because of the non-exercise of it?
Okay, yeah. So that's why we said make it easier for workers to join, right? Like I don't know, make unions less demanding, but if you can have your policy, then we can have our policy as well. But we think in simple, if unions demand like a policy for you to pay them a large amount, then make the amount smaller or subsidize the amount that you have to pay to become unionized. If unions demand a lot of time, then enforce restrictions on how much time they can demand from you as a worker. If you can have your policy, I don't understand why we can have these things in place as well. Now moving on to my second argument about why this desire should not be, why this decision should not be made by workers. And here there are a couple of premises that I want to cover. The first is this idea of desperation, right? Because more often than not, as they concede, workers who want to participate in selling this right are probably desperate for some economic benefit. This means that, they aren't thinking straight because they're not earning enough. So they think that the current value of that money that they might get from selling the union right is great. But we tell you that it isn't necessarily the case. Why is this so? There are a couple of problems here, right? Because first is working conditions change, or the conditions behind wage change. We point you to things like inflation, which means that the price should go up for how much you were paid. Or maybe there are economic changes in the environment, which means your work suddenly becomes more valuable. These are all things that you will no longer be able to negotiate for, and you must be able to negotiate for them. These are things that you will no longer be able to negotiate for, because then you have sold your right to do that for the small benefit at that point in time from being able to sell that right. And this is where we answer this idea because of some people not being able to exercise them. While right now, there might be some people who aren't able to exercise the right that you gain from unions. If they sell the right, they will never be able to exercise that right. Which at least in ours at the house, even if they don't have access to it right now, over time they might be able to become unionized and gain access to the negotiating mechanisms that come from unions. But on their side of the house, it's permanent. It's like suicide. If you kill yourself, you're dead. At least in our side of the house, if you join the union, you have the ability to negotiate in the future. But the second thing is this idea, is that wages aren't everything. Meaning even if you sell for an economic benefit, that's not the only thing that unions are there for. They're there to negotiate for better working hours, for example. Or they're there to negotiate for better working facilities. These are not economic benefits that might be in your calculus. These are things that unions as a whole have to negotiate for. So what does this mean? It means that workers aren't in the best place to make this decision, which is why the state has to intervene and prevent them from making this decision, because workers are blinded by number one, the desperation, and number two, the idea that economic benefits supersede everything. When in reality it's not the case, because these are other things that they have to be cognizant of, which they might not necessarily be. What if I told you about it? I was talking about why the state cannot allow you to sell this right in principle because it has to protect fundamental freedoms. And number two, I talked about why workers should not make these decisions. If you're on the side of keeping people from being sold into slavery, essentially, which is what their policy is, side would save your black. The only high school team that broke is going to be the only high school team that's going to the quarters. Thanks.